And today's question: how can security be restored to the Sahel region? A deadly attack in Burkina Faso on Sunday night saw at least 18 people killed at an upmarket restaurant in the capital Ouagadougou. The West African nation has suffered sporadic attacks from jihadist groups operating across the Sahel, notably near its border with Mali. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and other jihadist groups appear to have expanded in recent years. They hijacked a Tuareg rebellion in Mali in 2012, and while French forces intervened to stop them there, they've continued to sow terror and indeed spread. Luke Shrego gives us a quick look at the situation on the ground.
It's the beginning of 2013 and French President François Hollande has just launched Operation Serval. The target, Al-Qaeda in North Africa and its local allies, which had taken over northern Mali. France beats the extremists into submission on the ground in just a few months, but political perseverance doesn't follow the military victory. It leaves the militants more determined and they take their operations underground. Ground forces, though, don't give in. Operation Serval becomes Operation Barkhane in July 2014, a combined military presence designed to track the extremists and prevent attacks across 5 states: Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad and Burkina Faso. There's just one problem. Troop numbers have fallen from 5 to 3,500 across a theatre of operations larger than India, leaving France to try and coordinate not just with UN peacekeepers, but local military forces as well. 3 years later, the militants are anything but beaten.
They're able to set up a huge meeting in northern Mali despite the presence of France's Barkhane forces, MINUSMA and other armed groups. They hold their meeting and officially tie themselves into this idea of a global jihad.
July 2nd this year and the sub-Saharan G5 launches in Bamako with French President Emmanuel Macron in attendance. Its aim? Building a 5,000-strong force of troops from all the nations covered by Operation Barkhane. The work's certainly not for the faint of heart. Each of these countries are among the poorest in the world, ravaged by arms trafficking, drugs and people smuggling, all areas that fund international terror.
As you can see, their military operations struggling to retain control across such a vast stretch of land. What then is the solution? Well, to give us their expertise, we're joined live by satellite from Washington by Rida Lamouri, a Sahel researcher and analyst with the Sahel MIMO Risk Consulting Group. Thanks so much for joining us. And perhaps as we have a good connection to yourself, we'll start with you. And just, can you give us an idea? I hope you could hear the report there looking at the situation across the Sahel region. Do you think it really is as bad as we perceive it from the outside? Is it getting that much worse over recent years?
Yeah, yes, it is safe to say that it is getting worse, especially in the recent years, especially as we notice the expansion of jihadist groups in the region. Previously, attacks were limited on Mali, but only on northern Mali, but then expanded in 2015 to central Mali and now to a neighboring country, Burkina Faso. And this came right after the creation of the new coalition named the Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin in the Sahel
coalition
region.
Of jihadist groups, extremist groups.
Correct. And so they rejoined forces and they demonstrated they're taking whatever necessary steps and tactics in order to survive the presence of MINUSMA and the French forces in the region. The first 3 months of the creation, they mainly focused on Mali, but in the past 2 months, we saw them claiming attacks in Niger and Burkina Faso. And this is a clear indication that they are not severely impacted by the presence of foreign forces in the region, and it's still deteriorating, and several steps needs to be taken in order to eradicate these groups from existing in the region.
So exactly, what are those kind of steps? If military force isn't the answer, which, as you say, you mentioned the UN peacekeeping force in Mali, which sadly was under attack itself in Timbuktu this Monday. France has something like almost still 4,000 troops on the ground. There's now talk that the solution is forming this G5, this coalition of 5 African nations to form their own military force. Do you think that's likely to help, or is that more about France wanting to take its men home?
It will likely going to help the creation of the Sahel G5 because it's not a Malian problem, it's not a Burkina Faso problem, it's a regional problem as we see these groups are operating across the borders. However, we know the Sahel G5 still, it's a new organization that is going to require a lot of support from its partners, especially Western partners. And also, it's going to take time. If we're going to see an impact on the situation on the ground, it is going to take a lot of time and train and prepare 5,000 troops at least, as they claimed. It's going to take a lot of time. And as I mentioned, these groups are aware of the situation, the operational situation on the ground, and they take whatever necessary tactics to continue to exist and survive. And for example, today's attack this morning in Burkina Faso, it's a message by the group to show that they're still existing and they're still operational in order to support their propaganda in the region and encourage recruiting of individuals in the region.
Okay, Mr. Lamouri, stay with us on the line from Washington, but I'm going to bring in another guest now that can join us live on the phone from Senegal, Mr. Andrew Lebovich. You're a visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Lebovich, we've just been talking there about, we've just heard in the last couple of weeks of an idea supported by France and Germany of forming a G5, a coalition of 5 African countries to again enhance military presence across the Sahel region in the fight against jihadi groups. However, that's going to be very expensive. Do you think that that's actually going to get up and running in the short term? Or like our other guests, do you think that that's not perhaps the only way of dealing with this crisis?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge first that there has been some increased cooperation on the ground. The G5 exists already. It's a question of this joint force that's being constituted over time. I think on the one hand, the numbers that have been put out for how expensive the force will be are almost certainly exaggerated.
For 400 million a year, and the EU is willing to give 50 million, I believe.
Well, given that the French operation Barkhane costs around 600 million euro a year, the 400 million euro, at least according to everyone I've spoken to in the region and outside, is quite exaggerated. I think it's probably more aspirational than anything else. But I agree that there are potentially other ways to confront these issues, and certainly improving low-level cooperation, regional coordination, intelligence gathering, and also just basic governance in Mali in particular, but also in the broader region, are all priorities that may come before a sort of coherent.
Is that part of the problem? Is that part of the problem? Because we saw in Burkina Faso they have sort of a homegrown terrorism in recent years. Notably, one radical preacher that was arrested in Mali. He was imprisoned in 2015, I believe, and was then imprisoned actually in 2013, released in 2015, and went back to Burkina Faso. Is there, like we've seen at a European over here in the EU, a lack of communication sharing between those neighbouring countries that are all really facing the same risk?
Well, they're certainly trying to work together to improve coordination, improve communication. It is a significant problem, and it has been for several years. I think also the problem is simply that the threat and the presence of these groups has grown dramatically in the last couple of years, and it's spread across the region, especially after 2012, in ways I think many people within the region did not expect. And so it is metastasizing in its own way. Obviously, we shouldn't exaggerate the extent of these threats, but it is posing a serious problem, not just in Mali, but in Burkina Faso and in Niger, along the borders of Mali in particular.
Absolutely. Stay with us, Mr. Lebovich. I'm just going to bring back in our other guest from Washington, Mr. Lamouri. Hearing there, low-level cooperation necessary, but also even beyond entirely a military scope. Are there other things we need to do? Because a lot of this Sahel region, it's a vast desert where the governments have largely abandoned that region. There's not many people living there. Is there some other ways, more different ways of getting life back there and then gaining control that way?
Absolutely, there are many ways to improve the situation on the ground, and as you mentioned, there are a lot of areas that are less populated than the major centers. They're not necessarily abandoned or ungoverned, but they're just governed differently by a local population that's programs need to involve this local population, local communities, in order to find the common ground with local authorities and work with local forces. And that's something that Malian government especially has to focus on, is to improve the image of local forces in areas where actually jihadist groups are successfully, they gained some sort of popularity and they managed to succeed. It's because of that image that local forces are unable to bring security in this part of the country. And we were afraid that we are going to see the same thing, or we're seeing some of it in Burkina Faso on the borders with Mali, and that's very concerning. And that's why I think a military operation has to take place simultaneously with programs to improve governance and peace building, collaboration with local authorities, and improve the image of central government in this part of the country.
And very funny, how much do you think international countries should get involved? We're hearing the EU, notably France and Germany, saying they want to offer their support very strongly. The US, in favour of this G5, the group of 5 countries coming together, but definitely doesn't want to finance any part of it, as far as I understand. Do we need international cooperation, or is it more these countries are on their own?
Definitely need the international collaboration, because they need financial support and also some capacity building, because this is something new to everyone, and in order to successfully compete and also defeat these groups in these areas, there is a need for regional and international collaboration. I personally conducted the regional assessments in the region to see how much collaboration there between different actors, and unfortunately there is not a whole lot of collaboration and different actors intervening in combating violent extremism in the region. They're not collaborating, they're not communicating, and one party doesn't know what the other party is doing, and that's why there is a need for increased collaboration, so they can defeat extremist organizations operating in the Sahel.
Okay, very finally back to you, Mr. Lebovic, and quickly as you can, really, on such a complicated topic. But again, what are you hoping to see in the next months or weeks? What's the first thing that really needs to be done? Is it, again, an increase in military presence, or does something else need to be done?
Well, I think it's not strictly a question of increasing the size of military forces in the region, but certainly increasing coordination and capacity, and actually trying to better understand these environments and understand what is happening in these places. It is a core problem, because more security forces in an environment with less information, or a failure to deal appropriately and actually interact appropriately with local populations and with border communities in particular, will potentially only make these problems worse. And so it has to be more of an integrated effort than just putting in more security forces, whether they're local security forces or international forces.
Indeed, a holistic effort then needs to be put on the ground. Hearing that conclusion from both of my guests, I'd like to thank you both very much for joining us here on France 24. Mr. Ridel Amouri, Sahel researcher and analyst across in Washington, and Mr. Andrew Lebovic joining us there from Senegal. Thanks very much. That brings us to the end of this debate on France 24.